We're here another week at Mutant Watch, and we're like really excited. I'm like super excited for this show, in case you can notice. And we have today three amazing guests. We have Erik Ojo, who is right here, um, and he's like an artist, founder of the hashtag transmasc artists, and he also does like a video commentary. He has one really cool video commentary of Magneto and mental illness that I recommend you all to check after this. And I'm really excited to have him on this show. And we also have Dorian Alexander, who you can watch like right there. They wrote a comic for the Neve called The Mystique of Mystique, or Fluid, and it's a comic about Mystique's transness. It's pretty cool. I love it a lot. And they also have like a couple of papers on the team. So the team that we're gonna talk today is gonna run around some of those issues. And we also have Rhayne again with us, a Carefree Black Nerd, Carefree Blair, just there. And Rhayne does a podcast about representation in media that is pretty awesome. And I'm pretty sure that these next days he's gonna be releasing some new episodes that you also be attentive to. So what are we gonna talk today? Before we start, we're gonna talk about the LGBTQ plus aesthetics in the history of the X-Men. We obviously can't cover everything, so we're gonna go around some general points. And the reason is because right now we're in the middle of the Hellfire Gala, which has some queer stuff to it, especially on the looks part, and because looks are a big part of why how we consume media and how we relate to media. That's mostly what we're gonna talk about today. And I think I got everything covered. Stay tuned with us. And after the show, I have a couple of other events recommendations today that are happening, but I'm gonna peep those sometime in the show to remind everyone. And I think we can go now.
This week on Mutant Watch.
So first of all, first I want to ask everyone, especially of the guests, but everyone, about how they relate to the historical context of when the X-Men started to be queer, or we started to relate to it as queer, and how that kind of how they relate to it. This doesn't have to be like a sum up or something like that. It can be just your own personal experience about that. And that would be the first one. So who wants to go first?
I'll go. For me, it's always been that. Like X-Men and queer have been like hand in hand forever and a day. As a kid, learning that I was different and seeing like Spider-Man, Superman, and whatnot. I think I gravitated towards the X-Men because of these flashy colors. Honestly, there is some sort, and I don't maybe not have the vocabulary for it, but there is a like through line from watching Disney villains like Jafar and Scar and Ursula to like switching over to these brightly colored monologue giving Magnetos and Jimmy Maddoxes and these Mystiques. So it's always been something that I maybe not have had the vocabulary for, but it was instant like, this is queer. This is acceptable. Even though some of these people are villains, this is where you fall in. So that's been my experience with the X-Men and queerness.
I can go next. For me, it was my first interaction with the X-Men was actually the Ultimate version. I found them in a library, and I remember reading them and having like a really strong attachment to them. But it was specifically the end of or the middle of one of the arcs where Magneto raids the White House and like is burning the American flag and has definitely not George Bush like licking his boots naked on the White House lawn. And I was in the midst of, raised by a very like conservative, evangelical, like Christian cult type atmosphere. It was during the height of the Bush administration. And so seeing that like someone makes such a clear case for, such a stand for, the current regime that exists can be broken down, and that people who are flamboyant, different, etc., can like take a stand against that. So maybe too much of attachment to Magneto there, but I mean that's just always been a through line for me. Yeah.
So I guess for me, I got into X-Men when I was a teenager, which I guess was a while ago, but so I first got into it through the movie, specifically X-Men First Class. So it was like I already was like making the connection like as soon as I was getting into it because of how like loud that movie is about Charles and Nick specifically. And so it was kind of like I was already getting it from the characters as well as like the implicit metaphor. And as I continued through the movies and into the comics, it's just like continuously like more of that like mix of like both the metaphor and the characters like screaming at you like this is really queer. So yeah, I think that was that for me because I didn't really have it like during my childhood through like comics or cartoons, even though I was like kind of like vaguely aware of it, but I wasn't like aware of like how like it would like relate to me on like a queer level until I like actually like engaged with it.
Gabriel and Travis, you can also talk.
Okay, I guess I'll go. So I am not the most perceptive person, especially as a child. So I missed a lot of the like implicit queer subtext when I was looking at it as a child. When I was growing up, the queerest X-Men ever got was fan fiction. And it wasn't until Peter David's X Factor that it really started to dawn on me that I can see queer context on panel. And then once that kind of opened my eyes, I was then able to kind of like retroactively see the fact that the X-Men are pretty damn gay and have always been pretty damn gay. And I was just buying the narrative that they weren't, that they were trying to sell. But the metaphor in and of itself, in a whole bunch of different ways, it is inherently queer and inherently marginalized. And it's almost like not almost like it is that they covered that up with this lack of on-panel representation.
So for me, when I was very young still, single digits, I had a lot of surgeries. I had a lot of work done, particularly related to being intersex. And so you go in the hospital, you're going to have surgeries and everything, but they also tell you things like, we don't know what it's going to be like when you hit puberty. We don't know what it's going to be like when you're older. And it might be this, it might be, and all sorts of confusing things. And I come from a comics reading family. We always had comics around, but especially in the hospital, you get dropped off a stack of comics. And I feel very lucky that I've been able to tell people like Louis Simonson and Peter Gillis that their work on New Defenders, which was an X-Men title at that time. 3 of the original X-Men were headliners in that comic at the time. And Louis Simonson's X Factor helped me get through a lot of that. That really helped me understand positions and things. Rusty and Skids, even though they never explicitly say anything with Rusty or Skids, Skids being unable to help herself from talking about how beautiful Jean Grey is, and again in the next issue, how beautiful Jean Grey is, that was helpful. When Iceman has problems with Cloud, who has a male form and a female form, and he's getting uptight about that, and Moondragon, who eventually does come out as bisexual explicitly, but at the time was still very uptight herself, calls him a coward for that and tells him that that's his problem he needs to deal with. That was a huge thing for me as a young kid.
So I think when I was, from a personal experience, right now, or at least today, I'm trying to look at it from an experience of like what I feel about it now and what I feel about it historically. But from a personal experience, I remember that it was kind of very comforting, especially when I started reading New Mutants, and I felt really, really close to these characters. And a lot of them have these like strange bonds between them that are really like pretty gay when you look at them, like Ran and Danny, or like Ileana and Kitty, or other characters that have this like very intense, very personal, very like a close, more than friendship to them, and that was pretty like good for me when I was a child. I also think with time I have like acknowledged that it was also pretty like toxic, because I didn't come out into much later than read this comic, so it was not like something that drive me to be open about it. And now that I'm open about it, I recognize the part that was more like toxic. But also I think I saw a lot of myself, or what I wanted to be, in myself, in a lot of these characters, and in the ways that they express around each other, in the ways they're physically close and tender, and that was a big part of it for me. And I'm gonna mix this one a bit with the next question for you all, which will be like, I'm trying to make it easy relating it to certain characters, but I want to talk about the aesthetic parts of the characters that we feel like look queer. For me, a really, really great example is Rachel, who was a character that was pretty much from the entrance of the comics coded as gender non-conforming. But I want to see how you all feel about that, how you all feel about the characters in, especially these first comics by Claremont, by Louis Simonson, that had these looks that were not within the realm of what was considered gender normative in that era, especially because it was the 80s. And I feel like the general idea is that everything was pushing towards a conservatism in media, even if the people were living a different reality, like between themselves. But I was not alive, so I'm just making up for context. And I want to ask you all how you feel about these characters. If you have a certain character that you're like, I love how they look and how that represents a specific part of queerness for me, and that would be the second one.
I can jump in. And it is not original Claremont, so I'm sorry, gonna jump past that. And I'm not sure how it would have showed up in the original context of the time, but looking back and in hindsight, Richter and Shatterstar in X-Force, like they tried so hard to make them so hyper masculine. They just somehow went a full circle, and they have this like Fabio hair, and they look really gay. And like I know that the whole point that Liefeld was going for was like Shatterstar's the man's man, but somehow he got to gay, and I'm not sure the roadmap that he followed, but once more, it's not something I picked up when I first looked at them, but then once I realized things and I took a step back, they always had that kind of queer punk grunge look to them. And I don't know what the 90s were like. I don't know if just everyone would have looked gay to me, but those two in particular, they just had that energy to them.
Sure. I was going to say Havoc from during the class, particularly Inferno. And there's a number of made annotations through a lot of the Claremont run, and it's not just Inferno. Like Havoc consistently is drawn sort of feminine and in feminine poses. Not always, but like it's notable when it happens. And I think it really comes to the fore in Inferno, where I mean, he's wearing tattered, just tattered loincloth. Like it's good look. But I don't know. I'd also just say early New Mutants. Like everyone was very, I don't know, just hornily dressed throughout the early series, and really you could say that about much of the X-Men in general. I think there's certainly a big shift, I think, in the 90s where it definitely feeds into a male gaze, and who is dressed hot becomes more of the women characters. But I would say through the 80s for sure, there's a lot of short shorts. There's Cyclops run around in itty bitty jean shorts. There's some really hot depictions of like Wolverine, Nightcrawler, etc., where they're just wearing like next to nothing, which I always enjoyed. But I think really Havoc would be the one that I think is really, which is strange because I'm not sure if they ever really put any in text like queerness to Havoc. He's fairly like heteronormative in his relationship with Polaris, but that Inferno rendition of the character, which might be something where they're like making Madeline Pryor more like, because she's in control there, so she's like mask coded, and so they have to like fem up Havoc in a way that seems very like heteronormative, but turns out queer when you're sort of like switching the gender roles of the characters.
Yeah, I like definitely agree with how Rachel like from the get is like super like queer coded, and I also feel the same about Rhayne, who looks very similar to Rachel in some ways, and it's just like really interesting. And you can even see that with Rogue, like they all like kind of like share this kind of like sort of gender non-conforming androgynous look, like with their styling. And it's like I think I can't remember who said it, but about how like as it left that era, it became more like sexualized, especially with like female characters. And I feel like you can see that most starkly with Rogue, like kind of like moving from this kind of like sort of like androgynous look to like suddenly becoming a kind of like more normative sex symbol. Both looks are like good, but like it's very much like a shift. I think another character that like kind of strikes me in that way would be Magneto, because he is like so like bombastic and dramatic with these like really like bright colors that aren't necessarily like feminine coded, but also are definitely not very masculine coded, yet at the same time being seen like not being like very feminized, but also at the same time not being like extremely masculine. And I think like it also is like kind of like in that Claremont era, especially when he was New Mutants headmaster and was kind of like wearing like these like really dramatic like suit get-ups and stuff like that. And yeah, I don't know, I just in that era there's like a lot of like interesting kind of like almost like fan service going on that was somehow like not heteronormative, and I'm not entirely sure where that came from, but yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Magneto's purple, sleeveless, giant M in the middle outfit, that definitely doesn't seem straight to me.
I would agree, Magneto for sure. But for me, it's always been Sinister. He's somewhat, and I'll kind of backtrack. I think it's honestly from that Disney upbringing and seeing these villains coded in a way that was intended to be evil, but like they were always, I guess, more fashion forward. They were more sleek. They had the colors that I gravitated towards more. So moving into my experience with the X-Men, it's been Sinister and those Magneto big personalities who are dramatic enough that they're supposed to be seen as evil, but I still can't help but to relate to them. And I don't know if it's just my own personal experience existing in the world as a black man, or if it's just no, these characters were just written well. But Sinister for sure. I had not seen anything like him. And then about the time that I learned about Sinister as a kid was about the first time that I think I'd ever seen like a drag queen and knew what I was looking at. And so it was just like making these different connections. But Sinister has always done it for me. Like as far as in your face, there's no way, like, there's no way and there is a way that this person is everything and kind of nothing at once. So yeah, it's Sinister for me.
Yeah, I think. Oh, sorry. should I go ahead or she go ahead?
Go ahead.
Okay. I like my first time running with Sinister. Like after I watched the movies, I think I went into the original animated series. I could kind of like prime myself for like the comics, and that was my like first run with him, and I was like shocked. And then like his I think his like team of like people who were screwing with the X-Men at that time were called the Nasty Boys, and I was like, wait, like that was like, oh, this is like. So yeah, definitely Mr. Sinister. He's like just so much in every single way.
Well, I think for me, because I was around the 80s and the 90s, the 80s and the early 90s, a lot of that to me doesn't seem queer coded so much as that's where all fashion was at. It was kind of a lot of that, like men in little booty short stuff. I think about Forge. There's that shot of Forge where he's in the shorts. They're super short, but he still got them cuffed up even shorter. That wasn't for other men. Like at that time, there was just a little more, and that balance went away somewhere in, I think, not even the mid 90s, like the early mid 90s. That balance really went away. And so when I look at those comics, I kind of don't see it that way as much as they were still banking for a straight female audience. And I don't know between the artists and the writers what they were really thinking on that. But definitely Rogue, when she was very early introduced and she had that double-breasted suit, that double-breasted suit looks way gayer to me than when they've got her in like kind of a boob sock outfit where we can see every outline. What really jumped out to me were things like Rhayne and Cat's Eye, like when they get together in one issue and they immediately get naked. And it's supposed to be completely unsexual and whatever, and they're just best friends who just suddenly got naked and left together. And it's like, that's gay. Bling's first appearance, they don't say that she's a lesbian, I think, for an issue or two. But when she shows up, she's dressing like Rogue. She's positioning her body like Rogue. She's all about Rogue. That was the gayest I think I felt about any character. Is she does, it's that do I want to be with them, do I want to be them thing. That vibe hit me in a bigger way than particular color or particular how much skin they're showing or something like that.
I wonder, has anyone read is it Marvel Fanfare number 40? There's a short story in there that's basically a rendezvous between Storm and Mystique, and I'd be interested, like, because the 80s just, I guess, seem queer. Yeah, you're right, because that's like where that fashion has remained, I suppose, largely. But I wonder, in that issue, it felt even further over the top. Everyone's dressed in leather and have like the leather straps and everything, and the big hair, the nipple rings and everything. And I always wondered, I was like, this seems to be that they're rendezvousing in like a queer nightclub. This has to be a queer like nightclub, right? I love that issue.
Well, and I can speak to that actually, because we just had a DC Pride issue come out, and Klaus Johnson, I always say his last name wrong. Klaus Johnson has a comic in it about a character coming out as an older man. But in the 80s, back in the day, he was out to people and he was going to clubs, and he took a lot of the Marvel staff, the bullpen, with him to gay clubs. And you can see a change in Chris Claremont's work, in Frank Miller, these guys that he was taking out who weren't necessarily, I'm not going to speculate on them, but they were like, they want to see what it's about. So he's taking places. And it changed their aesthetic in a big way. It changed a lot of the ways that you can see their change in ways that they deal with men and masculinity, but also just leather and piercings and all of this stuff starts to come in.
That's a great point to connect with the next thing that I want to talk about, which was like, you just were talking a minute ago, Travis, about the things that were not necessarily queer, but we were like part of the mainstream culture. But a lot of them started in queer culture, and some of them were like you talk about the leather, the BDSM aesthetics, which pretty much went into the X-Men comics full time. The disco aesthetics, there's a lot of things that are like these dresses that are like very like for the dance floor, and sometimes when they go to a space, the issues themselves feel like they're going to a club, not to another planet, because the lighting and the coloring of the books is like calling to this thing about like this shared experience of like they're mostly like dancing a lot of the time, like the figure, the way they dress them. And I guess I want to talk about what do you all think about these things that were pretty mainstream in the 80s, because disco music was big, the leather aesthetics was big, but they pretty much originated in gay clubs. They originated in gay culture, and they were reappropriated for the mainstream culture. And I feel like a little bit of what Claremont and Simon and Simonson and all these people were trying to do were like trying to write that cultural vibe into the books, trying to acknowledge that there was something that was in the culture as well. And that's something that interests me a lot, because it's like you can see that these things come from like a queer subtext, especially when they put tension into the characters, when they don't look exactly like other superhero comics. They don't look exactly like what you expect from your Superman or your Batman. And that's what I want to ask you all about. That's the theme.
Yeah, I like definitely just recently I was thinking about and like looking at that comic where Professor Xavier gets attacked and Callisto like nurses him back to health, but like when he's like down with the Morlocks, like she like I guess undresses him and like puts him in this like leather like BDSM kind of getup, like the kinds that she wears and the rest of the Morlocks kind of wear. And it's just like so interesting because you never see him in that kind of dress, and it just like Callisto and the Morlocks I feel like were maybe one of like the first ones that I can remember in the comics that like that was kind of like what they wore all the time. And also just Callisto in general like very much has that kind of like leather butch aesthetic from like the first time that you ever see her. And I just thought that was like so interesting. And yeah, just like through that entire era, like you keep on seeing this like pop up constantly, all these kind of like situations in which characters are like tied up or they're like in like really and kind of dark revealing clothing, or like having like transformations and things like that. And it's like very blatant that like somebody somewhere is like really into seeing this happen constantly.
So one thing that, and I don't think this is answering your question, so I'm sorry again. But what comes up is kind of what Rhayne was saying earlier about like the queer coding of Disney villains. The X-Men has, as far as I'm aware of, always been presented as being this edgier message than the rest of the Marvel universe, being more, I guess, forward. And queer culture, queer aesthetic has always kind of been on the forefront of a lot of aesthetic revolutions. So by tapping into that, whether it was their intention to tap into queer culture or just tap into the edgy fashion forward culture, and it just ended up queer coded, just like how Disney villains are almost across the board queer coded, because that is seen as being the other, being kind of extra, being maybe at best the next step that will soon be appropriated, and by adapting it, they're kind of getting ahead of the curve.
Well, and I think too, and I kind of want to trace it back to Neil Adams in a way where X-Men has had this tradition of just really hot men, and that's emphasized. One of Neil Adams' big achievements was taking Magneto, who was this pop-eyed, angry all-time villain, and taking his helmet off, and he's like, he's a good-looking guy. This looks like a guy. And that comes, I think, all the way down. I know with Jim Lee, he went to school with Jodi Picoult, the author, and she will talk about when he was in school, they used to see him with like male nudie magazines or a lot of fashion magazines all the time, and they just all thought he was gay. Everybody thought he was gay because he was always walking around with a magazine with a naked or half-naked man on it. And then, she's like, later on, she's like, oh, he's learning how to draw, superheroes basically in bodies. But it translates to his work. When you look at that, especially that early Jim Lee work, that's what it looks like. They look like fashion plates. They look, it's very romanticized in a way that I think other artists from that same kind of image group, like Layfield, is not quite doing the same thing. Other artists weren't quite doing the same thing. So I think there's a line of that where things have come down from queer cultures and just influenced then fashion first, kind of, or fashion forward. And then as soon as it's there, I think X-Men artists, X-Men writers, a lot of them have been very forward. But also like Louise Simonson, who, as a writer, but also as a longtime editor and a huge influence, was just a hell of a lot hipper than I think a lot of us kind of want to look at her as. Even her comics right now, where she's adapting novels at DC into comics form, and she's very deliberately keeping the queer content, and in some cases enhancing the queer content. And you don't see other writers. I can't think of another writer who in the last 2 months called a character Ace that was not in this is a special pride issue, right? It's just Louise Simonson who threw that in. And so I think part of it too is they were just familiar with things. Some of these people were more familiar with things. They knew people, or they were dating people, or in her case, she was married to a trans woman. And so we kind of have to, I think we want to say it comes in. And then I stopped myself and realized, no, some of this is their, lived experience. It is their lives. It is people that they were sharing their lives with.
Well, I agree. I think a lot of the queerness of it, be it the aesthetics, maybe the way in which you've formed a relationship. At the time, 80s was big and glam and wealth and all that, but a lot of these queer spaces are just like subcultures or the otherness. And I think it's much easier, or I would speculate it would have been much easier to take your first time at like a drag show or your first time at a circuit party or something and like seeing something that's brand new to you. So why not, like X-Men is the kind of ground zero for that type of experimentation. So I think that a lot of it, though, of course, is influenced by places you've been and people you've met and seen. A lot of it is just maybe just getting ahead or trying to make the best story, trying to like make the best look and whatnot. But even within all of this, something that, and I may not be able to get it out as eloquently as I'd like, but something about everything that you guys have said is that for a certain sect of people who are reading these books, who are cis, hetero, no experience in gay, queer spaces, they're just reading a story, and everything is up to interpretation and perception and whatnot. But it's almost like folding in some of these aesthetics and conversations and relationships breaks these comics up into like two different worlds. Because I have a sister who's heterosexual, she's into me, and that's it. And she's read through the books and have enjoyed them, but we've gotten two totally different things out of, say, like an interaction between, I don't know, Mystique and Destiny before it was like, look at them, look at what this is. And so not that you asked, but I don't know if this is a detriment or a help to it, because then you get down to different fandoms that say, well, why are you pandering social justice warrior and such and such? But the context has been there all along. You just weren't privy to it because you're not in this community or adjacent enough to this community to see, well, maybe Bobby was queer all along. So that's my long-winded kind of answer, but yeah, I'll stop there.
I absolutely agree. And you said that you're not sure if it's a good thing or a bad thing. I think it is an absolute bad thing. Very much with the example of Bobby. There was a lot of pushback when he came out, and then there was a lot of queer readers who were like, well, look at this comic, look at this comic. Like we've been know this. Like this isn't something new. But because they approached their reading of the X-Men from their perspective, and the heterosexual people did not have that perspective, for them, it's seen as being blindsided. And when the reader may already be closed-minded, that just helps them double down.
I think
Yeah.
it's inevitable in some. Go ahead.
Oh no, you can go ahead.
Okay, I'm very quick. It's I think it's just inevitable that different readers from different backgrounds, we're going to see some different things, and so it's going to happen no matter what. What I would like is if there was some more support, and it's great when there is support from the talent on the books or the editor or the publisher. And we don't always see that. I'm not going to name names, but there are some writers who have written some very queer content their entire career who are still saying, well, I never really felt like there was a space for a queer story in my X-Men run, etc. And, so I think the readers, it's going to happen no matter what. They don't have to be bigots about it. That's their choice. But seeing something or not seeing something, I think we can't fault people there. But I do hold, I wish that the talent would speak up more sometimes.
Yeah, it's like, because it's always going to be like a product of where people are coming from. Though I feel like in some ways it's part of the whole like mutant metaphor thing that makes it kind of muddled enough that people who aren't reading X-Men with explicit thought to what it is talking about, to the fact that it is about marginalized people, it's very political, come to it and are somehow X-Men fans and are like, but this isn't political, or like it would be so strange if they were like queer or something. And it's like hard because I, like, as a multiply marginalized person, cannot see where they're coming from very well. But I just feel like in general there is a certain subsect of people who read comics who don't want to think deeply about comics at all. They don't want politics in their comics, even though the entire medium has always been political. There are people like that in every single kind of media, movies, whatever. They'll be like, it's just superheroes, and it's like, it's never been just superheroes, but okay.
I wonder if sometimes there's when it's not directly representational, where it's not like an explicit Bobby is gay now. I sometimes wonder if people do pick up on certain queer aspects of the X-Men, but also they don't denote it as queer because it can also be a part of their own like lives, that like queerness as a practice or attitude, or rather than just an identity. So there's a lot of people who don't see queerness in X-Men, but they're also blind to the queerness they themselves like are capable of practicing. And so that when it becomes explicit, there's a sort of like, well, I am not queer as an identity, so then I like resist the representational, like when it becomes explicitly representational. Which I think there's a lot of potential, I think, in using popular culture and the X-Men, etc., to when we can train people to get practiced at reading things queerly, then they can both recognize that, you know, in themselves and others, and if that makes sense. But I also agree. I want to see more like explicit stuff as well. Just because, you know, but there's also, I feel like, something that's sometimes lost when it becomes explicit, because what queer, it's usually always like through a straight heteronormative lens, like half the time. And so the what I feel is, and this gets into a problematic area of defining like what real queerness is, but I feel like a more authentic queerness, when we're talking about like Mr. Sinister being just like a drag queen, or the flamboyance of Magneto, then someone like Bobby, where it becomes this like what the mainstream version, it becomes like a I Love Simon version of queerness, rather than the more like radical queerness that I tend to read into figures like Mystique, when, you know, they're running around shifting their gender and all of this other stuff, you know.
It kind of becomes queer characters for straight readers.
Yes, exactly.
So picking up directly on that, I wanna ask you all about some examples, like Dorian just said, Mystique, about some examples of the stories that for you represent that, like seeing queerness pick up in ways that is not usually like just tell a story about a character that is gay. And I'm gonna start myself, because I just pick up a comic that in this cover represents a lot of things that we talk about here today. And I don't know if you can see but in this era, the look of everyone from Storm to Rogue to a lot of other characters was like a very bad look. And they just like, there's an issue where they go to a mechanic to repair cars, and that's the whole story. And there's like a lot of things there that feel like casually very queer to me, and very like, in a way, very joyful. I would have hoped that they just like kiss after it. That would be like the best. But there's a lot of that there, and with Rogue, with Storm, with Dazzler too. They have like this vibe. They are fighting, but sometimes it doesn't look like they're fighting. It looks like they're smashing. and I need to put that in a clip. So I want to ask you all if you have examples of that, because I feel like for me, there's something like really, when I approach this, knowing what it is, knowing what I can expect from it, and knowing how I can reflect myself and how I cannot, I gain a lot from reading these things, and I gain a lot of like vivacity and like joy from it. So I want to ask you all if you have examples of that. Dorian just say Mystique. Maybe you have some story in mind, and yeah, that would be mine.
I can speak to Mystique explicitly. I've written a little bit about it. The first 6 issues of the Brian K. Vaughan Mystique miniseries, Brian K. Vaughan really just picks up on a trans reading of Mystique. And if you go back and look at, I mean, it's not really subtle. You know, there's one constantly throughout the series. Vaughan sort of tricks you into assuming that the like very hot male gay, like cheesecakey sort of woman that's shown, tricks you into thinking that that's Mystique, and then Mystique turns out to be like this like older dude or someone else in the room, and he's clearly playing with your assumptions there. There's even a scene where right after a sort of trick like that, Mystique walks into a bathroom, and this other agent is just like, aren't you in the wrong bathroom, and like surprises her. There's like there's a trans character in the comic that Mystique sort of has a small like superhero fight with, but ultimately like helps. And again, the same agent is sort of like, you're doing this because you all are alike, right? You always help the people that you see yourself in. So Vaughn is just really just hitting you over the head for the first 6 issues there, that like Mystique should be read as trans. Unfortunately, when Vaughn leaves the series, the person who picks up after him just does not handle it well. And the last 6 become like, RuPaul jokes and other just really problematic nonsense. But Vaughn in that initial thing, I think, is very, very, very queer story.
For me, and this might seem like a bit of a stretch, but Chamber and Angelo from Generation X, and also Everett, like I think, am I part of the MTV generation? I don't know. I was a kid in the 90s. And so a lot of the imagery that I saw, and then being a young kid, learning about your queerness, and then learning how the world sees you, how you see yourself, and then how you're able to relate with people you're forced to be around, like classmates. A lot of my own like relationships, like close bonds, were very much like I saw that in Jonathan and I saw that in Angelo, and then more explicitly for me as a kid was always the design of Everett, because I'd never seen a black boy, well, one in X-Men comics really, but then to have this rainbow aura around him, and he was always either so extremely masculine and big just by nature of being a 90s comic character, but then when Chris, because I've always butchered his last name, started drawing them with the more Disney doe eyes and the softer features where Generation X kids look like kids, a lot of the queerness that I would read in my own like imagination and my lived in experience, I saw that in Chamber and Angelo and their relationship as friends, and then more explicitly with Everett and his, when it came to his powers of like, I am using this rainbow aura to pretty much assimilate to my surroundings. So if you're fast, I can become faster. And that for me was like, you're able to assimilate in a way that people focus on your talents and how great those are, and they don't see your queerness. So I could draw as a kid. I mean, I still can. I'm a funny guy. So I'm able to read a situation, adapt to it, and then kind of distance my queerness away from the situation so that there is no stress, no conflict. So that was like those 3 characters growing up reading Generation X. That's all looking back on it, that was like what I got. That's what I got from those 3 men. And it's, I still hold on to it to this day. So it may not have been as overt as others, but that was always my surviving mechanism or whatever. Like that was my security blanket. So those three characters.
I definitely agree that Generation X, and once more, maybe just in hindsight, has very much queer undertones. It's such a counterculture type of story, type of team. Almost any leader in that team is female. You have Husk, who's the smartest, Jubilee, who's the most experienced, Monet, who is the most powerful, Emma Frost, who is just in charge. And there are these strong, powerful women taking the forefront. And all of the animosity and the tension are between the female characters. Pretty much M and literally everyone, but also with Jubilee, and it's all of this kind of same gender tension. And then with the males, it's all this same gender friendship. It's not too much crossover or as much crossover unless they're trying to really push that romantic storyline. So I definitely see it. I definitely agree with you. my one I would have brought up was actually going to be Falling Angels. The original one, it just has this message of Roberto running away because there's this thing inside of him that he can't control, that he feels is just going to cause pain to everyone around him, and it makes him different. So he runs off and he finds other people who feel the same as he feels, and they create this found family. And to me, that always read as, you know, a very queer story, since it is something that a lot of queer people have to experience, with the leaving who they thought was their family and having to kind of create a new family from the ground up.
Something that I guess would fit into that question for me is like basically like I guess countless interactions between Professor X and Magneto over the years to like continued tension and friendship and this kind of like coming back to each other like eternally no matter what kind of thing, this kind of like circular relationship. Though I guess like a panel I can think of right now that's like particularly I guess egregious is when I'm trying to like remember the exact things that were happening. I think it's after Magneto's trial. I think it's Fenris that attacks when Charles gets gravely injured and Magneto needs to take over, and he's kind of just like just like over him with like his like hand on like Charles's cheek, like promising that he'll take care of the kids, and that's just like a lot to me. And I think something that like really like struck me, especially like I guess recently, was with like I guess in the Hickman era, because I was like catching up to it a lot recently, was like how many kind of like casual kind of like just like very like loaded statements or like kind of like visuals that there would be recently. I think when I think it was Hepzibah and Rachel at the Summers house, and she was asking about her spikes and like leaning into her, or when Logan and Jean are talking about Colossus and she's like, he's got a big heart, and Logan's like, he's got a big everything, or like the joke in between Logan and Scott when they're talking about like he's trying to like invite him to I think like the lake or something like that, and he's like, Jean's gonna be in a bikini, and Scott's like, and I'm gonna be in a Speedo, and Logan's like, I can't miss that, and just like stuff like that that is like sometimes it feels like kind of like jokey, but not in a way that's like haha, like it would be so funny if I was gay or something, but something that is like kind of like casual like jokes in between like people who are involved in some way. And I think like a lot of that actually is like kind of like surrounding like the whole like kind of like polyamorous relationship that Scott, Jean, and Logan and the kind of like Summers family is having right now. And I just found that really interesting because I'm so used to like when people are like, this is so queer, something about something particular, that they're reading into it or exaggerating more than it actually is if you're just reading it. But I was surprised because those things were so clearly there and I wasn't expecting it from this run. And I'm hoping that in some way it continues, though it is also like there's also just like a lot of like baiting and not like making it very clear with like the main characters. Like there are like side characters mostly that get the like the explicitly like queer like solidifications, but the main characters are still in this kind of like limbo. And I think that was in one of the comments, like an ask about that or something. And so it's like kind of like both like yay, but also like I'm still frustrated. So yeah, so that was long-winded.
No, that made a lot of sense, and also like I feel like it's a thing that repeats in X-Men comics because we're having that again, and it clearly connects with the issue you talk about Magneto with his Uncanny X-Men 200, which is the one you talk about, and it clearly connects with this thing that you read, and as a queer reader, it is that intimate connection. You feel that, you know that, you understand that, but it's also not understandable for everyone, or not like really. You can undo it. Some writer can come and undo all of that without explicitly undoing it, and that's kind of the danger there. So that's, if someone wants to add anything, the question was about that, about about like if we feel like they could undo all of this because of the Disney thing and how Disney doesn't like gay people, and if someone wants to add anything about it.
So I have very strong feelings about what seems to me, at least very clearly, all the baiting happening in the Hickman era, because it is so easily undone. For those of us who are looking for it, we can point and we can say, see it, it's there, it's been there. But then when Hickman is done and they got a new writer, it wouldn't even take any effort to undo any of it. I don't think that it does have anything to do with Disney or Marvel, because it's not new. It's not like we were getting all of this explicit queer rep before all of this happened. So I don't think that we're seeing a change for the less. We can make the argument that we're not seeing progress because of this, sure, but I don't think that it's taking us backwards, because we've been pretty far back.
Well, I think, just recently there's been some flap over Jean Grey and her current costume, the mini skirt. And the defense is they've got a thing that's written up in the Krakoa language now that says free thighs for free people. And I'm like, fuck you. There's statements from some of the people involved with Marvel that it's for the lesbians. And it's like, no, it's not. So I think, there is some goodwill approach in this current era, and there are some people who are doing amazing work, and some people who could be doing even better work if they were given some more free reign. But there's also obviously, levels to this, and there's somebody upper at some point who is maintaining that things should be on this inference level, or here's what you get, here's your consolation prize. And the consolation prizes, unfortunately, some of those, they are really easy to take away. And if all they're going to give us for queer representation is a joke here and there, Kitty Pryde kissing somebody she just met who's at their job, which is not the representation we need at all, or Jean Grey in something she wore when she was 16, that's not so good.
Yeah, I'm mad at whoever made the lesbian argument. It's absolutely not for the lesbians. And so I think we can now connect with another thing that we got on the script, but Danny asked about pretty explicitly before. And I think the way Danny asked is very to the point and pertinent, and is how the Hellfire Gala fits onto some aesthetics that are also around mainstream culture, around RuPaul's Drag Race, and around the Met Gala, around a lot of things that happen in the real world, that is appropriating aesthetics of ballroom culture and sex workers and poor people and poor trans BIPOC people, and how that could be happening here. What do you all think now that we still don't have all the gala out, so we don't know what's gonna happen, and they wanna put more things explicitly onto it, but with what we have and with the kind of involvement that has been, the kind of promotion that has been done with it, with the list of famous people attending and all that stuff. So how do you all feel about this question? I think Danny asked it very well.
I guess I'm kind of going backwards from the Hellfire Gala, but I was reading a paper about fashion in the X-Men recently, and that was when I learned more about how Dazzler, in her first iterations was supposed to be black, and it talked about how they were taking from these very black aesthetics, say disco, but they were applying it to a kind of use like a term like more like virginal or like purer, like this like white woman, the Dazzler that they end up going with, and like how they're like taking these like aesthetics that belong to, in a sense, like by POC, LGBTQ by POC, and applying them onto characters that are white slash assumed heterosexual. And it kind of like makes me think in general about how it's in line with a lot of the issues with X-Men and how they will take these marginalizations that are very clearly like taken from racial marginalization and queer marginalization, disability marginalization, and will put them onto not all but mostly white heterosexual characters. And it's like, I guess it's like the problems within the mutant metaphor. Like, why must the metaphor be for these white people? Why can't they also be like black or queer or black and queer, etc.? Like, it just like kind of feels like an extension of that like misappropriation. It's like, I don't know, it's like they're marginalized, it makes sense for them, but also they're not marginalized in the same like real world senses that cause these aesthetics in the real world, if that makes any sense. But yeah, I don't know, it's also kind of a little bit removed because I feel like the Hellfire Gala takes more from the Met Gala than necessarily ballroom culture, but at the same time the Met Gala itself takes from ballroom culture, so it's kind of like just a part of this like wider misappropriation. I'm not entirely sure if it's very pointed because it does take from ballroom culture, but it takes from high fashion. But high fashion also takes from ballroom culture. Basically everything, the way that fashion works, it takes from the marginalized people making like new stuff and then like makes it into the mainstream, or makes it inaccessible. So I don't know, it's very complicated.
I absolutely agree. I think that there is that underlying message that you're writing a marginalized group without that many marginalized people. Aside from your fictional marginalization, that has always been and continues to be a big problem with the X-Men. Specific to the gala looks, and I'm not making any excuses for the appropriation, but I feel like it's so many different layers of appropriation. That is, these kind of like gala extravagant looks are becoming more mainstream despite its trans BIPOC origin. And I think that it's more taking it from these kind of accepted pop culture references. And yes, it absolutely needs it absolutely needs marginalized people on the panel to go along with it. But I think that I don't think it's a direct appropriation of this ballroom culture.
I think, for me, bottom line, the Hellfire Club is a club for rich rapists, period. Every early Hellfire Club story is them kidnapping somebody and making Storm do some kind of weird race play so that they can have sexual things, or taking over Storm's body so that they can have some weird sexual things, right? Sebastian Shaw is a rich, abusive pimp who runs a strip club. That's bottom line. You can dress that up. And as villains, okay, I can either take a story or I can just pretend that story never happened. But when you're going to take that and celebrate that and defend that as this is mutant culture, the Hellfire Club is mutant culture. What you're saying is that mutant culture is abusive, rich white pimps who run strip clubs. And you look at the celebrity guests that they have, and I don't know how they chose those or what their criteria was. I can make guesses, but it's like one cool white guy, Kevin Page, who I guess has to be there, and like 10 white people I don't know. When I looked at the costume designs, and some of them are cool, some of them are not so cool, but a lot of fans did ones as well. I couldn't really tell when things were coming out on Twitter what was a legitimate design and what was not. And a lot of the designs for non-white characters were racist as hell. And some of that's fan and some of that's professional. And I don't know that we've had enough representation of any non-white ethnicity that we're prepared to go in there and have them do something, even if it's, quote unquote, ironic. We're not at a place where we can have ironic racism in the X-Men. So I have a lot of issues going in. I don't know that I'm really going to dive into the gala when it starts playing out.
I can. Do you want to go?
No, you can go.
I was going to take it back to, I think some really good points are made about the Hellfire, club in general. And there's a really good issue near the end of New Mutants where Magneto has a fight with Sebastian Shaw. And it's very, very philosophical about how to appropriately, to Magneto's point, do mutant liberation. And if you remember, the Magneto sort of getting cozy with the Hellfire Club for a while, and that's why a lot of the New Mutants are sort of becoming suspicious of him. But Magneto basically says that during that superhero fight, while they're debating philosophy, he tells Shaw that there is no way that we can actually attain mutant liberation by putting a few mutants into powerful places. The sort of breaking the glass ceiling approach is what gets you mutants creating sentinels, essentially. And Magneto dishes the Hellfire Club, and right around the same time goes back to sort of even suggests that Xavier's way of doing things isn't correct, and that it's closely associated with a very neoliberal multicultural model of liberation, where you just put minorities or marginalized people in powerful positions, a few of them, and that's supposed to help, right? And I think we're seeing a lot of the same thing when we talk about the Hellfire Gala, that it's really just an intensification of a lot of the problems with the mutant metaphor as it is centered on the X-Men in general, because the X-Men have always sort of cozied up, especially during the very beginning, to an assimilationist, we're going to work with cops, we're going to work with the army against the evil mutants who are evil because they're, trying to create a separatist state for themselves. They're radical. And I've done a little bit of work attaching Magneto is a villain because Magneto was originally being written in the 60s, is sort of an amalgamation of communist tyranny and as well revolutionary black radicalism, and especially in some issues in Avengers, where storms the UN and says we're going to create a separate nation. So I think that maybe that's the problem with the Hellfire Gala in general, is it's sort of just this intensification of an already problematic metaphor that is problematic because it is explicitly a neoliberal model of how civil rights works, and all the revolutionary dialogue is always villainized and made into an extreme. The actual liberationist, abolitionist approaches are always tied to the villainous characters, and then usually switched into outright terrorism. Usually, the only reason that Marvel has ever keeps their villains evil, because the villains are always making the actual points. They just have them I think really great examples like Killmonger. We're just going to have Killmonger execute a random innocent person because otherwise the audience is going to recognize that he's actually the good points. And the same is true with Magneto. Anytime Magneto gets too much of an anti-hero, they have to make him destroy all of New York or try to kill all humans everywhere or everything else. They have to make him into a terrorist, because ultimately that's what the most hegemonic institutions, of which Marvel belongs to, views as revolutionaries have to be terrorists. They're synonymous to the perspective of power.
I agree. I agree. And if you've seen Falcon and Winter Soldier, they did the same thing with Carly Morgenthau. Like I randomly, she started, spoiler, killing people. But that being neither here nor there, I agree. I agree with everyone. A lot of the problems you've said, and I think that with the aesthetics of the ball, the interesting thing is you mentioned how the Hellfire Gala is pretty much this raping, pillaging, colonizing evil corporation from back in the day. And now you put this fancy, beautiful sheen over it where you're taking aesthetics from these marginalized communities and I liken it to a lot of the conversations around Gen Z language. That's African American vernacular. But because it's seen on TikTok by a certain type of person, and those are the people who are getting more of these views and For You page or whatever else, now you've taken something that's inherently belonged to a particular culture or originated there, and now you've changed the meaning. The something in reverb, which used to be chopped and screwed music, which now they changed the name of that. And it's like you can pull from these things that you say are pop culture, but you're not looking at their origins. So when you have a Hellfire Gala and you have all of these weird takes and ways in which you are making these characters more sympathetic, or you're trying to make the lesbian issue or the queer character, but you don't have those people in the writer's room, in the creative team, it's frustrating. I think that it's not always intentional beat for beat. Like, I don't think someone sat up and watched Paris is Burning and was like, let me take this specific look and put this on Emma Frost, and let me take that. But there is a larger system at play where, because the Hellfire Gala is so far removed from Paris is Burning, it makes it more difficult for people to say, no, this is where this comes from. Where when the majority of people, their first time seeing a lot of these fashions and styles and whatnot is the Hellfire Gala, is the Met Gala. It's like you're punching down. The people who created the space for you to appropriate these cultures and these images, they have no voice, because now at large you've turned it into this, the way in which, I don't know, just you've taken not necessarily the power, but a lot of the power, for lack of a better term, away from the people who originated these things. And these people were marginalized, poor, and all these other isms or whatnot. So they don't have the power to say, no, I am Pepe La Beja, and this is something that I originated. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's so frustrating for me. And again, this may not even be involved in this question, but every year on my Facebook, when the thing pops up again, I always ask, where are there two black men who are queer who are together in a comic that is part of the big two? It's always an interracial relationship, or it's this tokenized person, or this like lighter skinned person. This is my roundabout way of saying a lot of these aesthetics that we have that are ascribed to things like the Hellfire Gala, they become something entirely different, which is fine because art imitates life and vice versa. But I think things like the Hellfire Gala allow you to try to remove the dangers and the past and the horrors that these people have done, even though they're fictional people, away from those actions, because it's this new shiny thing. But this new shiny thing, this new image you have, isn't even, it's stolen from the people that I don't know. I feel like I'm rambling at this point, but forgive me. But yeah, it's frustrating. It is. I can enjoy it for what it is because I like the X-Men, but I'm gonna stop there.
You weren't
You're not
rambling. You were just
rambling.
listing point after point.
Hey,
You were on fire.
Look,
You were amazing.
look in the guest list. Okay. If I may, there are so many people, and you don't have to. There are so many other celebrities, and like you said, I don't know how they went about selecting. Maybe it was a certain group of people who said use my likeness, sure. But there's so many other people. Why wasn't Laverne Cox there? Why wasn't? And forgive me, what's the trans woman who was on? Shit. shoot, excuse me, I'm sorry. There's a I just learned that this woman was trans. I watched the MTV trans documentary, but she was like the first woman. She's a white woman, long blonde hair. She was like the first trans woman to be seen in a role where she was just like a love interest. It wasn't her transness. Like, all that being said, there's so many other people who should have been on this list. There's so many other people in sports, in media. Like, this is weird. This is weird to me. This is very weird. And I've read through a few panels and I'm like, a lot of this does not make sense. Why on earth is Marshall here? Why is this man here? Is this a rebranding? But so yeah, that's my 2 cents.
You know,
I mean-
and especially this year that they didn't put people like Lil Nas X or people that are like relevant in such a huge way that they could get them to be in a Marvel comic. Like, I'm sure they would say, I'm sure he especially would say yes, because like, and they're like signing away and putting like Eminem, like. Like, how is Eminem relevant to any of the things they want to put on this aesthetic, on this what they're trying to sell us that this is? Like, he's not relevant in that way. So yeah, what were you gonna say, Travis? Sorry.
So yeah, no, I mean, yeah, most of the people I think that they've chose, they don't seem to be particularly fashion forward. They don't seem to be particularly linked into anything, except they're linked in with Marvel. But what the question made me think of as well is, y'all remember Stacey X from X-Men? She was a sex worker who was on the X-Men for a while, and they were so shitty to her. And that kind of has stayed with me, as that's how they think about people. Because you have scenes in there, like there's one with Wolverine where he has this like supposed heart-to-heart with her, and it ends with him saying, if you don't want to be treated like a whore, don't look like one. And it's like, fuck you, Wolverine. There's her backstory is she works at a cat house that Warren owns, that Angel owns. And it turns out that Angel owns all this sex worker stuff, and he owns this. He owns these guys that are running drugs, and he doesn't know where his money comes from. He doesn't care where his money comes from. It's just money. But he is so high and mighty with her as well. And when I look at it, she's talking to her boss. That's all it is. You can be rude to your boss. You can get angry at your boss. And he and the other X-Men are like, no, he's an X-Man. He fought for your service. Blah. And it's, I don't know Joe Casey's politics. I don't know his, life, whatever, outside. So I don't know what side he was taking. Are we supposed to look at the classic X-Men as these guys are all like ultra right-wing assholes? Or, what, I don't know what side we're supposed to take, but it's always sort of stayed with me that that's the only representation of a sex worker that we've had in X-Men to any significant degree. Other than drawing like 5 hookers in the background of a scene to show us it's a bad neighborhood or whatever, that's all we've had.
I'm interested if anyone ever read God Loves Man Kills, as like the people who save Kitty Pryde. I always read them as gay hustlers. I'm not sure if that like anyone else ever read it that way.
Now that you bring it up, I it's like I can't unsee it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's more like that makes sense.
So I definitely agree with what everyone's saying. I was sorry, I'm gathering my thoughts. There was something that Danny said that really tied into my thought about the Hellfire Gala and what y'all were saying about how it's kind of the X-Men are butting up with this kind of inherently morally bankrupt concept of the Hellfire Club, and it kind of even connects to the way that they're cozying up with these morally bankrupt people such as Sebastian Shaw and Mr. Sinister. Sebastian Shaw is this massive abuser. He's literally abusing people on the page in Marauders, and then with Mr. Sinister, the Nazi, and it's just it's really strange. And also specifically with what Danny said about Mr. Sinister, kind of transforming into this kind of like gay flamboyant drag icon or something like that, like very much giving that, especially in like the Hellfire Gala, and just everything about the way that he's being written now, kind of like endearing himself to the audience in a way that feels inappropriate in the way that they're taking from this kind of like gay aesthetic, and also that it's not quite the same as like in the past where like it's like a villain that you know is a really bad person, and like because of that you like he's not like a kind of like Cruella de Vil character, you know, like before. It's kind of like how they're trying to do with Cruella, like, oh, they're gonna make Cruella into a girl boss or something. It's like we don't need that. Like it just feels very strange, and I feel like it's probably a thing in the storyline that like buddying up with all these like objectively bad people is going to blow up in Krakoa's face, but it feels like the seriousness of this like kind of like narrative trajectory isn't really noticed by the people who are writing, and it just comes off just very, maybe disturbing is like too harsh a word, but it's just like it's not great.
It's this kind of like dissonant feeling. Like it's one thing when Sinister is kind of this like subtle, tangential, queer-coded figure, but now that they're leaning into it and just kind of writing it in this way, like we're just not going to talk about the horrible, you know, kind of bigoted things that he's done in the past. We're just going to pretend that didn't happen, and we're going to lean into this flamboyant, foppish character. It feels weird. It doesn't settle if you stop and think about it. And I don't know if they're just hoping that we don't stop and think about it, it's something that's kind of a thing in the Hickman era, is just like, oh, there was that time jump, so things happened to explain everything that we're just never going to put on the page, but it happened. It feels off.
Well, and that happened before with X-Men when we got Dr. Nemesis in X-Men. And the last time we had seen him in the 90s, he was a Nazi. He was not even a Nazi. He was like a boss Nazi. He was a serious Nazi. And the company line was very much, we're not going to address it because it would be too complicated to address. Well, then why are you using a Nazi character to be the friendly, wacky guy, the smart guy? You know, it felt very like the worst version of Project Paperclip you can imagine. They've taken the Nazis and the eugenics guys and they've made them you know, queer-coded snarkers.
I wonder if there's something at play here where, you know, they're still it's sort of like most mainstream like attachment to queer people. Like they still have to be heteronormative in their demeanor. They have to be the I Love Simons. So like, you know, gay like who's the most feminine queer male character in more like maybe North Star, and he's like metrosexual at best. So the people that you still have to make you know, you can't have, if they're gonna be feminine queer coded, then they have to be still icky.
That also like reminds me like I like one of the recent Hellfire Gala issues, I think it was Hellions, and it was when Nanny was like interrupted like a conversation between Mr. Sinister and Black Panther and Thor to like be like, also he like abuses and kidnaps and hurts children, and like and then like Thor and Black Panther are like, I have to be somewhere. And like it's supposed to be like this like jokey joke thing, and like I mean I guess it is like kind of funny because like he is and he's not a good person, but also like when you think about that and you think about the way they've been coding him so far, it's just like that's really weird and gross for you to say like in this kind of like, it's just like it's so weird. And I feel like that scene in particular was like kind of like it just like kind of like encapsulated like the whole weirdness of like these actions. Like you're going to make this man who is a Nazi, who hurts children, who has no regard for people's consent, like bodily or otherwise, and you're going to like make him into this kind of like, I don't know, background character of Drag Race. Like it's a lot, and I feel like even though there are like a few like queer people on the writing team now, it's like it's just there's not like there's definitely just like not enough, and or maybe just not enough people who are cognizant of these kinds of things, and it just ends up being damaging. I don't know.
I think that there definitely is missing a line. Like X-Men particularly, but kind of comics in general. It's kind of like there's no too far that someone can't be rebranded and come back from, and I feel like there really does need to be. Because we have all these like mass murderers, and once more, it's comic books. It happens. It's been happening. We have always had villains come back as superheroes, dating all the way back to like Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch. It's always been a thing that happens. But I also think that there should be a line in place when it's like, okay, you have done too much. There is no redemption to getting on this big team, because you literally, Sinister has made orphanages to kidnap children. Like, there's a line, and it's just we don't acknowledge that line.
Well, and if they don't make this is the line and you absolutely can't cross it, I would like to just see characters bring stuff up, because it's the first thing you would bring up. If you were working with Mr. Sinister, these things are going to come up very quickly. If you're working with the Hellfire Club, things are going to come up. To take it to the side just a little bit right now, I like that Frenzy is an ambassador for Krakoa, because Frenzy has a history of being racist about all kinds of people. She's got a history of anti-Asian racism, anti-Native racism, on top of the human mutant thing where she was very hardline about that. And I would like to see that brought up. I would like to see her go meet and like, Mr. Prime Minister, this is Frenzy, our ambassador. She has referred to your people as X, Y, and Z in the past. Because they have YouTube, they have records of things. And we don't ever really see characters get called out on these things. We get a lot of that, just forget it happened. Forget that mass murder happened. Forget that orphanage full of children that they put there happened. Forget how they talked about things. And I would like to see, for me, it always pulls me out if I know something about a character and I know the characters know, and nobody ever says anything, because somebody in any group can't keep their mouth shut.
You see, that 6 months that we just jumped over, it was just sensitivity training and group therapy. They got it all out of the way.
See, I almost, Joey, I wonder, this is how we're conditioned to like respond to power. I won't get into it. I had like deep problems with like the way that like the Scarlet Witch television show, like the political ramifications of like how easily that they forgave Wanda for enslaving people. But I feel like the same thing is here, is they're conflating redemption with accountability, I suppose, right? And that's the way that, let's take the United States for example. That's the way that they want to say that as long as we say we're good now and say we're sorry, we don't have to do any. That's it. We don't have to do any reparations. We don't have to be held accountable for everything that has been done in the past. It's in the past now, and that's the way that often these powerful characters, there's a certain right to power that is being subtly insinuated or explicitly insinuated in all these stories, where it doesn't matter what you do in the past, as long as you're on the right team now, that's all that matters. And we're not going to try to propagate a need for accountability, because institutions of power don't want that in the real world. So, corporate institutions and the institution that is the Hellfire Club or even the X-Men, like they don't want to have power start needing to be, they don't want to tell a story where power is held accountable.
If I can piggyback off that, it's, oh my God, there's this thing, again, for lack of a better term, where if we push the Hellfire Gala as it is, and we push enough issues and enough years go by, you will forget about the past in the sense that we're just getting older. There is constantly going to be new fans of properties. Now you not only have the X-Men 92 cartoon, you have some of the newer comics, you have the newer Fox films, and whenever they get into the MCU, and with this Hickman era, I would imagine that this is where they'll pull some of their aesthetics and everything from. And so when you have so much space between the now shiny new thing that all the new kids, the new fans are jumping on, you are removing so much. Because we brought up America, you're removing so much history that has been laid down from the beginning. Everybody's not going to go back to the 60s and read those comics. Everybody, there's maybe a 14-year-old class of people who are like, I like Hugh Jackman, I like this Hellfire thing. I even listened to Eminem as a little kid. And so now they're jumping on point. Is the Hickman era, is the Hellfire. So they get this romanticized view of, oh, Emma looks sickening. Oh, Monet, she is killing it. But then we're in a weird space because you can't tell someone they're not a fan just because they just now got onto X-Men or that they have to read the history. So we're in this weird space where I think it works out in the best way for Marvel, for the company, because you do have this sort of history and you won't address it. And you have this big flashy event and these big new superhero stories and whatnot. But then when someone calls in the question, it's easy enough to say, oh, that was the past. People thought differently back then. So we're trying to move on. So I feel like that's something that's going to happen. And it's just like with American history and world history. There has to be someone going to the back where things started and making sure to keep this forefront, because you can like the Hellfire Gala and everything that's going on and also recognize how terrible the comics were back in the day, but then there is that disconnect. Like you said, where are the characters saying, hey, Sinister, you did this, Emma Frost, yeah, you got these diamonds and stuff, but you also were a terrible person for a long time. And it's so that you said America and it just kind of set me off. But yeah, there's kind of separating from the history and banking on people not digging into the history.
I think that what you have brought up about that, it's being separated from the history because there's this different generation of readers. It's kind of the same thing that I think that we were all saying with the appropriation of trans BIPOC characters and ballroom culture, is that was a different generation and society is a bit more removed from that. And if we are not making a conscious effort of acknowledging that history, then the credit is what's getting lost. If we are not acknowledging the problematic history of some of these characters, the harm that it did is going to be lost.
I want to throw in a second there. I'm wondering, a counter what I sort of put forward is, if we talk about maybe a more a character we have a greater attachment to, like Magneto, right? We have the Magneto, it was right sort of stuff, and I have a lot of Magneto memorabilia because it has to do with queer revolution to my mind. Magneto has also been written to do a lot of irredeemable things, right? So there's also something at play here, or there's, comics are different than real life history, I suppose, in that these villains are also used to make moral commentary for their readers as cautionary tales. So one writer picks up Magneto and infuses a lot of marginalized separatism politics or more radical abolition politics, and the next person picks them up and says oh, well, we need to make sure the readers know that we think abolition is evil or bad or whatever, so we're going to make Magneto murder a bunch, commit genocide or something like that. And I think that's a slightly different case than characters like Mr. Sinister or the Hellfire Gala, who, I mean, maybe Emma Frost, but Emma Frost and Magneto have been given the anti-hero treatment. There are other characters that haven't. So there's also something to think about here, I guess, is villains are written specifically, as these cautionary tales, etc. So are there elements of them that we want to carry forward, we all have selective memories, I suppose, with all of our characters, right? Even all the good guys. Let's talk about like Scott and some of the stuff that he's done, right, in the X Factor era with his family and stuff, right? Or almost there's no one who hasn't like been gotten a hold of by like a writer that just went a direction with the character that we disagree with, and then it becomes a no true Scotsman argument, I guess. Like, I don't know. So that's a complicating factor. I still stand by a lot of, I think, what people have been saying.
Yeah, I was definitely thinking about that, especially when you mentioned Wanda and on Division, or I mentioned in Comics Wanda, about how sometimes stories, it will be a complication of the fact that the action itself is irredeemable, but like the real life part, the metatextual part, is that the reasons behind the fact that these were written were bad. Like, for instance, like the whole House of M decimation thing with Wanda is like born out of like the long-standing like issues of Wanda being written to be crazy. Just a bunch of misogyny, ableism, racism, etc., that caused like the writing of Wanda as like this kind of tool of like mutant decimation, but also mixed with the fact that this decimation of a marginalized population cannot be just like like erased. Like this genocide essentially that like hurt like all of these mutants must be accounted for, and it's going to resonate throughout the narrative for a very long time. And so it's kind of like these, and like you were saying about like selective memory, like there are so many things that all of these characters have done that are just absolutely awful, that can be attested to like these like writers that don't understand these characters, break these characters, have internalized like isms, etc., that color the way we write these characters. And I guess like it's just part of like how comics is like this like very long, endless, collaborative kind of way of writing that creates all these kinds of issues, that like facilitates all these kinds of issues. And I guess it just like kind of comes down to like what makes the most sense to address. Like, again, like what you said about how like Emma and Magneto have gotten the anti-hero treatment, so it makes sense for them to be allowed to be X-Men, to be allowed to be seen in these kinds of ways. But people like Sebastian Shaw or Mr. Sinister have not shown that they have any interest in being good people or anything like that, and their crimes are very big and don't have any kind of like sympathetic like view to them that you can get from Emma Frost or Magneto. So it's kind of like you kind of have to like find your way around this with comics, but it's not being done in the same way with like every character. Like for me, I don't understand why it was necessary to like go with characters like Mr. Sinister and Sebastian Shaw when there are, tons of other characters that would be better in their place, that maybe aren't like the most moral, but have, just aren't them, don't have their kind of character trajectory. I don't know. And like, it's not bad for villains to be like part of something. Like, it's not bad for villains to like be in the story. Moral ambiguity is very interesting, but I don't feel like the story has had anything interesting to say about these things so far. I was also going to mention, with regards to Mr. Sinister, it is insane. Like, I cannot understand like how Magneto is on the same, like, on a council, has said absolutely nothing about Mr. Sinister when he's a Nazi scientist, specifically a Nazi scientist who, if I'm correct, has experimented on him specifically. And it's like, as like y'all have said, like they have access to all of these facts, they have access to all of these comics, but they decide that it's not relevant. And like, sure, like maybe a lot of people don't know that, but even if you don't know in specifics, you're like, it just doesn't make sense. I don't know. Sorry, I'm rambling.
Well, I think about too the difference how they treat, say, Mystique and Sabretooth. Over time, Sabretooth has been on the team at least twice. So they just welcome me to their home, and they do these weird things. Like the first time he comes in, and he's like, "I want to live here now," and they're like, "Okay, you can live here." And even though we know you're a psychotic, misogynist rapist who's murdered a bunch of women, we're going to have every woman on this team, every woman in this house, even if she's a teenager, go bring you your meals now and serve you. And that's how they treat Sabretooth. Mystique shows up. "I would like some help. I'm mentally ill. I'm traumatized as hell. Half of my family live with you already. Can I stay here?" "No, we can't trust you." "Why would we trust you? We're going to put you in." And they, when she's on X Factor, she's got that big rig on her. They inject her with stuff to make sure she doesn't betray them. And it's a very different way of treating two characters who are, in many ways, coming from the same place. They're both villains. They're both manipulative. They're both sadistic. But the way that they refuse to deal with mental illness is a major factor there. But how welcoming they are, how willing they are to jeopardize their own people for the sake of someone like Sabretooth. Magneto was, they declared Magneto was bipolar, in 1991, and they've never dealt with that again. That was his reason for going off the deep end again when he's kidnapping Moira and torturing her. And I'm a huge Magneto fan. I'm not a huge Magneto supporter. Because I come from a comics reading family, a lot of my early comics experience was like 60s comics. My grandpa had comics around. Everybody had comics around. And so my Magneto, had slaves. My Magneto went down to South America and conquered a completely innocent nation that hadn't had a war since they threw off their, European conquerors 100 years before. That, I bring a lot of that. I can't help bringing a lot of that to Magneto. But when you look at Magneto as bipolar and traumatized, then I have a lot of empathy for him as a person, not necessarily his whole politics, but as a person. But the stories will never deal with that. We don't deal with mental illness in X-Men comics unless it's for wacky visuals. That's when mental illness comes in. It's Legion and throw in some kind of big display or whatever. Yeah, I'm not sure where I started with that, but...
Kind of circling back a little bit, I think that's part of what the problem is that these marginalized group, whether it's mental health, whether it's race, whether it's queer identity, it's kind of only utilized in a way to make it flashy. We don't really get to see too much of it just being part of their identity. It's either kind of a plot point that's supposed to be extravagant, or it's like we just don't acknowledge it. And I think that's where the problem of adapting it to the metaphor or to the aesthetics, I think that's where the problem is because, even if we have a character there who is queer, the fact that their queerness isn't acknowledged in a everyday way, it makes the adaptation be very performative.
And also circling back, I think a lot of the things that we have talked about, and Danny brought up in the comments, like sometimes it's like the Google transformative justice, but never kill the page, and that reminds me, like, the reason we are talking here today is because in the Hellfire Gala there's some things that we recognize, but they're not played into in a way that we can see the transformative potential of those things. And I feel like that's a lot of what you're all talking about. Like, we kind of want to see these comics like interrogate power and try to see how to deconstruct how these characters relate to power. And it's not always done, or it's not done in a way that seems like realistic to, like, like tell stories like the one that call what these characters represent, like marginalized group. I don't know if I'm making sense, but that's I feel like a big part of why we have navigated towards these other themes, in the way of like trying to figure out why the Hellfire Gala looks great, but what is happening, how they're making it, why these famous people are not, like, why not bringing the communities that can interrogate these power mechanisms into it. And that's, I feel like, I don't know, that's what I'm taking from the combo. And if anyone wants to add anything else onto this, otherwise I'm gonna like say thank you a lot of times.
I do want to mention Candace Kane is the woman. I couldn't remember her name. Candace Kane was the trans woman, the older white lady who I was talking about. I didn't want to end this and not actually. Yeah, so Candace Kane. But that's it.
Great. So if anyone wants to add anything else. Well, go ahead.
Actually, I was just like, this is so random though. Like, it's hardly commentary, but I was just gonna be like, I just feel like some of the outfits were, I guess, not giving what they're supposed to give. Like, it's not all I have to say, but like, I feel like some of them, I just feel like there could have been. I feel very much if there were more creators all around that were more involved in the ballroom culture and the high fashion culture, etc. This, and we're also like people of color, this could have been more like visually as well. And it was kind of shocking to me how some creators that I knew of that were already doing this were not kind of brought in to do this work. I don't know if we're supposed to name names or anything. I don't know if that's like taboo, but I was specifically thinking about Kevin Wada in particular, since he's been doing that like for years now, but he was not brought to the table. And I don't know, just like stuff like that just kind of makes me feel like this is like it's a really interesting step in like connecting more with like what X-Men is kind of about. Like it's about race, it's about class stability, it's about queerness, but I feel like it always will fall short unless the actual people that are being talked about are in control. So yeah, that's all I got to say.
Yeah, totally. So thank you all of you for coming. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Dorian, and thank you, Rhayne, so much, like for real. And I hope we all have all of you back at some time, because I know we have something planned with Eric that I'm not gonna spoil, but we have talked a little bit about that today. And Dorian, I would love to have you talk about Mystique someday. That would be great. Like just focus on Mystique, like big Mystique. So she's up here, and Rhayne, you're gonna come back. That's a given. And and thank you for the people in the comments. Thank you to Danny. Thank you to Ali. Thank you to Asta, and some other people that were like just amazing in the comments they made, and like kind of brought up the lively thing to the discussion. And I'm really, really happy about this. And I also want to like recommend, or more like inform people that there are two things happening today that maybe are important in the internet. And one is this event that I think starts in like minutes or something like that. That is called Roaring Rainbow, and that is for a series of concerts and stuff that is for trans youth. So if you buy a ticket, they're gonna like fundraise stuff for trans youth. And I'm gonna put the link here. Wait, you all can interrupt me while I put the links on the Federa if you want to say anything you forgot. And the other thing is that today is the 5-year remembrance ceremony of the Pulse shooting, and I wanna put that also in the comments. That is in like they have an online event too where they're remembering the victims, and it's in I think 1 hour, a couple of hours, and it's here. And that's all the things that I wanna recommend to people for if they are like scrolling the internet, those things that you could do today, and they could go to somewhere important and donate if you're able. And that's all I want to say today. So if someone wants to add anything, otherwise we're done.
Thank you, everybody. It was lovely.
Thank you for coming, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. You were all great. It was so amazing to like talk about all of this.